This is the Voyage Report podcast, where you get the scoop on travel. Now, the editor-in-chief of the Voyage Report, Mark Albert.
Greetings, fellow travelers, and welcome. Today, we're going to talk with the publisher and editor of Simply Smart Travel, a contributor to the Voyage Report. Jeff Orenstein runs simplysmarttravel.com, and he launched Living on the Suncoast magazine back in 2005, a publication for residents in that famous area of Florida. Jeff joins us now via Skype from Sarasota, where he lives with his wife, Virginia. Jeff, welcome to the Voyage Report podcast.
Thank you, Mark. Glad to be here.
So you've been doing some great work for us. Thank you very much. And some of our listeners will know that we run your Simply Smart Travel column every Sunday at voyagereport.com. You've traveled all over the world. Obviously, you've got a real passion for exploration. So let me ask you right off the bat here, what has been your biggest discovery, Jeff, while traveling?
Oh, wow. You have to understand that probably my view on the world is colored by the fact that I have 3 degrees in political science, and I was a political science professor for 25 years. So I tend to look at government and the political no matter where I am. But the biggest discovery I've made is that no matter how exotic the location, no matter how diverse its culture and values, there are certain undeniable similarities in human needs and behaviors and wants that I think any journalist and traveler needs to understand and respect.
Like what?
Like everybody I've ever talked to, in whatever continent it's been, wants good health, freedom from hunger and fear, and a decent life, no matter how he or she or his or her government and culture define that. To me, again, you have to understand my eyes are colored, rose-colored political scientist. The main variable seems to be government and political culture. Some governments are simply more generous, more egalitarian, and responsive to their people than others. And it makes a huge difference in how people actually live, irrespective of what they want in human beings.
In
other words, can I summarize? It's
Yeah.
kind of like there's not a huge diversity in human nature and values, no matter where you are, as far as I'm concerned, whether it's in Sarasota or Shanghai, but there's a huge diversity in governments and how well those governments balance the needs of those who are in power and satisfy the needs of the people at large.
So of all the places that you've been, Jeff, what is the most favorite?
Oh, geez, I don't know. I've really never gone to a place that I didn't like once I explored it in some depth, even Cleveland, my hometown, which I used to call the mistake on the lake. But I've actually been back there, and it's much nicer than I remember it. But if I have to name a few favorites, I guess my number one would have to be the Cajon Pass and the surrounding San Bernardino and San Gabriel Mountains in Southern California. That is really, I've spent a lot of time there for rather strange reasons, since I'm a train nut. There are a lot of trains around there.
Yeah, LA has certainly been expanding its light rail, Metrolink, and the subway system and all that, and there's a line now finally going to LAX Airport, the Crenshaw line that they're working on. That's
right.
Where I grew up, within view of the San Gabriel Mountains.
Well, I envy you. I actually have a little piece of Southern California in my garage. I've modeled the Cajon Pass in N scale. Other places I've really loved have been Barcelona and what they call the White Towns in Spain on the Mediterranean coast. I was really fascinated by China. Colorado, let me see, Canadian Rockies.
So asking you to pick one place was a mistake. I can see there are just so many.
I guess Canadian Rockies, and I really like the Gulf Coast of Florida, particularly right around here.
Well, listeners, Jeff just mentioned the Canadian Rockies. Banff, Lake Louise are fantastic. We actually have a top travel tips in 2 minutes video about that. And all this year, Canada is celebrating its 150th anniversary by waiving
happy
all
birthday,
fees.
Canada.
Happy birthday, and they're waiving all fees to national parks. So you can go to Banff National Park and the Canadian Rockies if you'd like for free.
We've been there, and it is fabulous.
Yeah,
it's one of
it's
the nicest
gorgeous
places in the world.
So what's the next place you're traveling to, Jeff?
We're off to, of all places, North Platte, Nebraska.
Oh, yeah? What's there?
world's largest railroad classification yard, Bailey Yard, and the Nebraska Sandhills. I'm not going to see the yard, but while I'm there, I plan on photographing the Union Pacific since as I said, I'm a train nut. And the state of Nebraska tourism folks are fond of saying it's a chance to explore where the West was won. So we're going to visit some Wild West stuff, Buffalo Bill's original show in North Platte, tub along the Niobrara River, and just explore Nebraska. I don't really know. I've driven through it on the interstate and never stopped, so it's going to be a first for me to accept the state of Nebraska's invitation to come on down.
Well, that's fantastic. We can't wait to read about it. Now, your columns for us have included so far Costa Rica, China, Barcelona, San Diego, North Carolina, among others. Last week's was on Temecula wine country in my home state of California. So I'm just curious, Jeff, how do you approach a review? I mean, do you research it before you go? I know that you've mentioned in some of your columns books for readers and listeners to check out for background. So how do you read up on a destination then before you go?
The internet is wonderful.
It is.
I just start Googling places and what I've heard about and what I haven't heard about, and I find the Convention and Visitors Bureau websites are a good starting place. Of course, there's a lot of hype there, and they want you to think that they are paradise. But I start to follow their leads and their links, and pretty soon I get a bit of a pre-education about the place. I read up as much as I can, and then when I get there, I just sort of keep an open mind and explore.
And I actually think that is just one of the beauties of travel. You know, in my life, I'm pretty structured, but when I travel, I like to just sort of go with the wind. I mean, you know, they're great. It's great to know that, hey, I want to see this attraction or this place or this monument, but then letting the wind take you where it will, and sort of, oh, this is an interesting street. Let me walk down here, or this seems interesting. I love that sense of adventure.
That's well said. We have found some really interesting streets in our life. Just exactly as you say. You look down and say, lots of interesting shops, and we have found stuff to buy and stuff we don't want to buy, and sites, and just struck up conversations with people at cafes that have been very instructive about the local area.
Now, listeners, we're going to ask Jeff a little bit later on for his tips for both the frequent traveler and the infrequent traveler, so make sure you keep listening for that. Jeff, I do really enjoy the little historical asides that you put in there and your interesting facts that you sprinkle into your writing. Obviously, the political science background has been key. For example, listeners, for Costa Rica, Jeff mentioned that the country is dedicated to carbon neutrality by 2021 and even gave us a bit of a language lesson. And for China, Jeff, you talk about English being part of the school curriculum. And in San Diego, you let us know that there are 70 miles, yes, 70 miles, I'm sure you walked them all and counted them down to the foot, but 70 miles of beaches. I love that detail. I mean, it really gives us a fuller picture of a destination.
Well, I love the detail too. That's why I do a lot of pre-research, and a lot of times my pre-research will leave me with more questions than answers. So when I get there, I start asking them. And no, I haven't walked all 70 miles of those beaches. Maybe 2 or 3.
So when you ask your questions, I mean, do you have any hesitation about walking up to residents, strangers, et cetera, to ask?
No. I'll start with the official tourism people, because they usually check in with the Convention and Visitors Bureau and say, hey, I'm here. You got any suggestions? Sometimes they don't, but... And then the best thing to do is stop for an afternoon coffee or a beer or a glass of wine and just start talking to people at the next table. I can remember one particular time when we stopped for a glass of wine in Vancouver after hiking hours through Stanley Park at cherry blossom time. And people at the next table struck up a conversation with them, and they recommended a really great Italian restaurant, in their opinion, in Victoria. And we were heading for Victoria next. So I looked up the Italian restaurant, and darn, it's one of the best places I've ever eaten all over the world. So natives usually are proud about certain things. And of course, you have to have a filter. You have to understand, their prejudices and where they're coming from. Yeah, Mark Twain, said traveling is fatal to prejudices and bigotry. And I found that's really very, very true. The more places you see, the harder it is to become prejudiced and bigoted about this place is better than that place. I just, as I said, I see a little bit of good in every place. Some, obviously are more scenic than others, and some have more cultural resources and financial resources than others, but every place has something really to offer. As I said, even Cleveland. And the Indians lost to Chicago, and I still love the town.
Now, let's go back. You mentioned Italian. So I noticed that on simplysmarttravel.com, one of the menu tabs is Simply Smart Gourmet. Are you a foodie?
Yes, a foodie and a whiny.
That's fantastic.
And I also, I'm beginning to develop an appreciation for craft beer.
Oh.
I don't know a lot about craft beer. As a typical American, I knew kind of bland American beer. When I lived in Europe for a while, back in my political science days, I did appreciate lots of good German beers. But now, with the proliferation of craft beers, we're finding more and more local breweries, and I can sit down with local brewers and explain, okay, what's the difference between hops and malt, and what am I tasting here? And it's been an interesting education to me.
So we have the column on Temecula and Wine Country. Are we going to be seeing a craft beer tour anytime soon?
I hadn't thought about it, but why not?
Listeners, you heard it here first, and it's an exclusive on this podcast.
Yeah, we're heading to Sonoma in the fall, so I'm sure we'll write something about that. And I've been to many other wine countries, but that was before my travel journalism days, so I haven't really written about places like Napa or Bordeaux and so forth.
So now your columns are syndicated and read by 1.5 million travelers each month, coast to coast. Why did you start doing this, Jeff? Why did you get into travel journalism?
I needed something to do.
Oh. That's a good reason.
Yeah, I'm retired from my teaching career. We sold the magazine, and I went from working 60, 70 hours a week to having a lot of leisure. And I said, well, what can I do? What do I love to do? I love to write. I love to travel. So, this may be a way to combine them both. I had no idea how to go about it, and just sort of started writing to editors and say, I like to travel, and I know how to write. Would you like to carry my column? A few of them said yes.
Well, now you've got a lot of destinations on your website under your belt here, and everyone really can appreciate your coverage, and that's what I like about your columns, is that they're very broad-based so that everyone can really appreciate them. Some of it, though, is tailored to the over 50 crowd. Do you find that age group travels more, is more receptive to travel advice?
Yeah, yes. First of all, people who are over 50 tend to either be retired or close to retired and at the peak of their incomes. And they have both the leisure and the wherewithal to travel, because travel, frankly, can be expensive unless you're going to backpack it everywhere and go in a sleeping bag or sleep in a sleeping bag. Travel tends to add up in terms of money. So, yeah. And my experience, and I am over 50 myself, way over 50 as a matter of fact, my experience is my friends and people that we socialize with around here in the Sarasota area all love to travel. And when I was publishing my own magazine, my travel column was the most popular, and I got the most feedback about it.
So that clearly has been a good demographic then for travel columns, travel journalism, and advice.
Yeah, I think so. And if you look at some of the figures for money spent, that particular demographic, the over 50, spends more than all of the other demographics put together, at least in the United States, in terms of travel.
All right, so if you are over 50 or under 50, both of those key demographics, we have a whole deals page at voyagereport.com to try to save some of that money when you travel. Jeff, you write on your website, quote, "The old over 50 travel largely focused on quiet luxury resorts, cruises that were long on leisure and short on activities and sightseeing, and gentle bus tours that started late in the day and got everybody back to the hotel in time for dinner. Boring. That's not
Yes.
the over 50 travel we're talking about." End quote. Who are you talking about?
I'm talking about people like me who like to get out there and climb mountains and hike lakefronts and haul camera equipment around and explore new restaurants and new ideas and new places, who are not afraid to get out of the bus and walk a little bit.
Are there enough destinations or tour companies or whatnot catering to that, or do they still think that their crowd wants to lounge around all day long?
There are lots and lots of them. There are enough. And I think the cruise companies have been pushing that because their advertising is saying, get out there and explore. Don't just hang around the ship, but pay for our expensive shore tours and you'll have a good time. And they are expensive, and you generally have a good time as well. Although my wife and I are not big cruisers, I have to admit, because it's a little too staid for us.
Oh, really?
Yep.
I was on a cruise. I've only actually been on one cruise, and I went with a buddy of mine, and we went to Central America, Belize and Honduras and all that stuff. And, we were really determined not to be on a bus with 40 people, doing the very staged cruise excursions. Some of them can be great and obviously save you money. So when we went to Honduras, and this is actually what we talk about in the Top Travel Tips in 2 Minutes video for Honduras, but we found this little tiny, it's actually called Hole in the Wall Restaurant in Roatan, Honduras, run by an American expat. You can't drive there, you can't fly there, you actually have to take a boat. It was a lot of fun, but that's the kind of exploration that I really enjoy, trying to get out and push some of those boundaries and those limits and discover what's out there.
I think that's great, and I wish I'd been there actually. My wife and I look for that too. We never have a set restaurant agenda. We never have a set activities agenda. As you say, there's certain monuments and sites that you want to see, and you have to include because you're a good travel journalist. But then it's like, okay, now what? One of the most interesting lunches I ever had, as a matter of fact, we were in London and we had just toured the Tower of London and we were hungry. So we went up to a policeman and I said exactly that we're tourists and we're hungry, but we're not looking for a typical tourist place. Where would you eat for lunch? He says, actually, you're in luck. My favorite pub is just across the bridge that he pointed to. And he gave me the name of it, and he even suggested 2 or 3 things to eat. And we walked in, and we were the only Americans in there, and the meal was fantastic. And he was right. I can see why it's his favorite pub. The shepherd's pie was really first class.
Well, I think that's a great tip. A lot of travelers will walk to the concierge at the hotel or somebody like that. And I think that's, you can do that if you like that. But I really like when you walk up to somebody, whether it's a stranger or your waiter or waitress, and say, where do you go? Because if you say, where should I go? They may interpret that you want a touristy place, that you want somewhere that all the tourists go. But I find asking, where would you go? Where is your favorite place? Really brings out some unique places.
Those are magical words. We lived in Switzerland for a while when I was teaching in Geneva, and we traveled extensively every weekend. And all the time we would go to a place and stay at a pension or a small bed and breakfast, and inevitably we would ask the proprietor, where would you go? What are your favorite places in town? And we discovered some fantastic places, and I can't remember ever being let down by that.
Exactly. Now, our listeners might know that we have a United States by rail page at voyagereport.com. And Jeff, you also cover rail travel. You write in one of your posts, quote, "Travel by rail is more popular than it has been in decades, and a golden age of passenger train travel is dawning in some places." Tell us more about that.
Okay. Europe in particular, but also in Asia, have discovered the fact that steel wheel on steel rail is probably the most efficient and comfortable way of travel. I don't know if your readers and listeners have traveled much by train, but usually a nice passenger train has much bigger seats, much bigger windows, much more leg room, and the ability to walk around. There is no flight attendant saying, stay in your seat and put your seatbelt on. After Europe got essentially destroyed by World War II, rather than rebuild an extensive highway network, they rebuilt an extensive rail network, and the Asians have followed suit. China and Korea and now the Middle East. Every place except the United States has a great rail system, but the United States, I think, is finally beginning to wake up to this. It's late. Once upon a time, we were the world leaders in rail transportation. We certainly lost our leadership, but I think places like California and Florida and Texas are starting to claw their way back.
Well, in fact, we had an article up a couple of weeks ago about Amtrak trying to get new Acela trains for the Northeast Corridor. It's most popular and most profitable. And there in Florida, there's a big rail project that's going to open in a couple of months.
Yes, All Aboard Florida. It is the first privately owned passenger service in the United States in well over a half a century. It is started by Florida East Coast Industries, which has since been sold, but the All Aboard Florida Brightline project is definitely a go. The new owners say, go for it. Sounds wonderful. They have had some opposition by local counties who have been not in my backyard kind of people. But it's supposedly, the first phase is going to go from West Palm Beach to Fort Lauderdale, which is not very far. Second phase will go to Miami. The third phase is going to go to Orlando, and then Tampa and Jacksonville. So it's going to be an interesting statewide rail system. In Texas and in California, there are both high-speed rail systems that are under development. In Texas, it's a private consortium, and the state of California is doing it as a public project.
One of my best trips that I think I've ever taken was to New Zealand, and they have a rail pass for foreigners, and so I rode the rails all the way through the North Island, and then you take a ferry between the North Island and the South Island, and then the rails all the way south through the South Island, and then all the way to the west coast of the South Island. That's a lot of directions, I know, but it was just fantastic. I mean, all day you're right on the rails, this gorgeous observatory glass overhead, and it was just a fantastic trip. And I know, Jeff, you were talking about the trains that you rode in China. I think it was 300 miles an hour?
Yes, the maglev. It's a very short trip. It's from Shanghai to downtown Shanghai to Shanghai Airport, but we also rode the high-speed trains, which go a mere 210 miles an hour.
A mere, yes.
A mere, right. The fastest, by the way, you mentioned Acela, is capable of 150, but it averages about 90, I hate to tell you.
Well, that's, I think, because Amtrak has to share the tracks with freight trains and whatnot, right?
Not only that, but the Pennsylvania Railroad main line was developed in the 1860s and 1870s, and it's full of curvatures and slowdowns and so forth. We need an entirely new right-of-way to be able to have high-speed rail capabilities. The trains can do it. In Canada, and one of the greatest train trips I ever had was we took the Via Number 1, the famous Canadian, from Toronto across the continent to Vancouver through the Canadian Rockies, and that was a spectacular trip. The nicest thing I think I can say about train travel, same thing I can say about taking an afternoon cafe break, is you get to talk to people. We spent 4 days on that train with mostly Canadians, and we got into, it was during the last presidential election, and they were very, very, very interested in American politics. When they heard that I was a retired political scientist, we couldn't talk about nothing else for 4 days.
Well, listeners, if you have not taken a long trip on Amtrak and you are considering it, we have a whole list of Amtrak discounts on our United States by Rail page, including kids. This may be the best part if you're a family. Kids 12 and under ride for 50% off. Students get 15% off, and so do seniors, 15% off. And unlike the airlines, Jeff, on Amtrak, you can check.
Right. I agree with you. Yeah, I've traveled extensively on Amtrak. I've gone across the U.S. a couple of times and up and down the West Coast and up and down the East Coast, and I recommend it. They're not as nice as European trains or the Canadian trains, but they're darn nice and getting better.
So, Jeff, you're writing an upcoming book, Simply Smart Travel, a handbook for savvy over 50 explorations. What do you hope to include?
All that we've talked about and a lot more. Some tips about where to go and and what to avoid and how not to get ripped off, and just elementary common sense in traveling. How to pick destinations and whether you should go on a tour or travel yourself. And I got a whole bunch of things that we're discussing in there.
So, listeners, we promised we would get Jeff's practical tips for both the frequent and infrequent travelers. So, Jeff, why don't you give us some tips that our listeners can use as they're out exploring the world?
My best practical tip I learned the hard way by lugging huge suitcases over European cobblestones, and that is travel light. Take everything you think you want to pack, lay it out on a bed, and put half of it back. And then take a good hard look at what you have left. Unless you're going to some wild and exotic places, there are stores, and if you forget something, you can buy something. You have to remember that you're going from place to place, and people don't remember what outfit you were wearing yesterday because they didn't know who you were yesterday. So you can even wear some of the same clothes, and you can launder it if necessary in your hotel room sink. So travel light.
Yeah, in fact, we actually have a column that I wrote on our website about why I never check a bag and why I would urge others to do it. I actually went to Pakistan for almost 3 weeks once, and I didn't check a bag for that either. And I actually had a suit with me. So I think traveling light is certainly a great rule to live by. What are some other tips that our listeners can use as they're traveling?
Oh, I think own and learn how to use a good camera. Even though cell phone cameras are getting better and better, in my opinion, there is nothing that can is as good and versatile as a good digital SLR with a very versatile lens. I carry an 18 to 175 zoom lens, and I have other lenses, but I hardly ever use them because that encompasses 90% of the shots that I need.
Well, and certainly carrying a DSLR allows you to vary some shots that you cannot get with a cell phone.
Yes, and if you carry a little hand tripod, or even if you don't have a tripod, if you find something to set a camera down on and use time exposure, you can get some incredible shots.
Jeff, are you a Canon or a Nikon person?
I'm a Canon guy.
Okay, we have diversity here then. We're representing both sides because I do Nikon, so this is great.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I kid people who are Nikon people all the time that why don't you get a real camera? But the real reason I'm a Canon guy and continue to buy Canons is because I have a collection of lenses and I don't want to start over. Canon and Nikon are probably very equivalent when push comes to shove.
Well, lenses can be expensive. I mean, if you already have the lenses, why start over?
They are expensive. They're far more expensive than the camera bodies.
Now, Jeff, what about the infrequent traveler? Perhaps somebody who has not been out of the country ever, or maybe only once a long time ago. What would your advice be to them? Maybe they feel like travel is a little overwhelming or a little intimidating. How would you encourage them to approach a future trip?
I would say if they've never been out of the country before and they're going someplace that they consider exotic, which could even be in this country, and they're not sure about it, they ought to do a little bit of consumer research about a good tour. There are good tours out there with intelligent tour guides who don't just drag you from one tourist trap to the other. Have to do a little bit of consumer research and find them, but for the infrequent traveler, it is a good way to go.
Now, Jeff, where are places that you have not been that are on your bucket list that you absolutely really want to go? For me, Antarctica is right up there on the list. Where do you want to go that you haven't been yet?
Antarctica is pretty high up on my list, and believe it or not, I've never been to Alaska, and we're going to rectify that soon, probably in 2018.
Gorgeous.
I am interested in Latin America and some tropical Africa. I'd love to go on a really good photo safari in Kenya or someplace equivalent to that, Tanzania, and find some amazing animal shots. But you know what? I have found places close to home. I found a place up in Pinellas County, which is St. Pete, called Tarpon Springs, which is amazing. I mean, it's incredible. It's an old Greek town with working sponge docks. How often do you see something like that? And it was an hour drive from my house. So my bucket list continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Along with your budget?
No, afraid not. One of the downsides of being a self-syndicated travel journalist with no salary is travel's expensive, and we have to be judicious about our travel dollar.
Jeff Orenstein runs simplysmarttravel.com, and he also was the brains behind Living on the Suncoast magazine, which launched more than a decade ago in 2005. Jeff, we sure appreciate you being a contributor to the Voyage Report. We always look forward to your columns, and thanks for joining us on today's podcast.
My pleasure, Mark. Next time I'm going to take you to the wilds of the Everglades.
Oh, wow. Is that a promise?
That's a promise.
Listeners, you can read Jeff's column every Sunday on VoyageReport.com. Which of Jeff's tips will you use? And what are your favorite tips and tricks for your fellow travelers? Let us know by rating this podcast, giving us a review, and sharing it on social media. We have guests every week talking about travel news and trends, so be sure to subscribe to our podcast. We'd sure appreciate your review. It helps bring more awareness to our journalism and original content. And if you have an idea for a future guest on our podcast, please reach out at VoyageReport.com and let us know. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Mark Albert. Bon voyage.
You've been listening to the Voyage Report podcast. Get the scoop on travel at VoyageReport.com.